We'll directly hand over to Nicolas Weber, whom we have already seen once today in the morning. He's with us from MetaGameHub DAO, and he'll talk about navigating through the open metaverse together. There you are. Welcome again, Nicolas. And while we are still setting up, use the Telegram group to post your questions, give us feedback, or just ask us anything you want to know about this organization or the event in general. And now over to Nicolas. Enjoy.
Hey guys, pleasure to be here. My name is Nicolas. I'm the founder of MetaGameHub DAO, and today I'll speak to you about navigating through the open metaverse together, right? Because when we speak about the metaverse, to me the biggest impact that the Web3-based metaverse can really have is really onboarding users for mass adoption to the crypto economy, right? Because you can have these gamified experiences for DeFi, for data tooling, for any other form of crypto or blockchain-based application, right? But if you really look at the current environment within the metaverse, then it's quite centralized, it's still not intuitive, the access to it is still lacking, right? So you really need kind of an ecosystem, a hub, a home base for users that can actually help them navigate through the space. But before we go into this, let's maybe look a bit at the current status quo of the metaverse in general, right? If you look at the metaverse right now, then it's quite fragmented, right? And, to a certain extent, in my opinion, we are already living in the metaverse, right? In the Web 2 metaverse, so to say, with our phones, with how we engage within the web space in general, right? With Google Meet, how we socialize on social media and all these aspects. And now we're just at that stage, at that inception point, where we're moving more toward the Web 3-based metaverse, so to say, right? So of course the term metaverse is quite hyped right now, but it's something that has been evolving for a long amount of time. It's really where everything from the web, so to say, comes together in a way, because it becomes much more tangible and much more frictionless, at least in the utopian future, to how it can become. So here, right now, if you look at the metaverse, there's not going to be one metaverse like Sandbox or Decentraland, of course, to rule them all, so to say. There's going to be an open metaverse where each of these sub-niche metaverses is addressing different needs and different, let's say, interests, right? So Sandbox is, for instance, more toward the younger generations, the creator economy. Decentraland is more focusing on socializing and value exchange, whereas other metaverses, for instance, like, let's say, Fluff World, is then again focusing more toward converging the entertainment industry with, the Web3 environment. So as you can see, there's different ecosystems, different forms of value, different chains, different layers of infrastructure. And of course here you need kind of an aggregator in that sense, and that is really our long-term vision with MetaGameHub DAO, as we want to become, to provide value to the users and to provide that intuitive user experience through this journey. Similarly to that's how I envision the journey at some point to be, right? How we have our phones now and we navigate, so to say, through different applications there, that these applications at some point can become metaverses or dApps, right, on top and built within these metaverses. Because let's take, for instance, DeFi, for example, right? DeFi is one of the killer applications in the crypto economy, but it's just used by maybe 10% of wallet holders. But if you have an experience that is fully gamified, where instead of going to the web app of a DeFi protocol, you go into, let's say, a building, maybe even a bank building in the metaverse, where you are assisted by bots, right, that support you throughout the journey of interacting with the DeFi protocol, then you have a tool for mainstream adoption that anyone can use, because now we move from a stage of having to understand applications to actually being able to use them, right? And that's really like the impact that the metaverse can have. But in order to get there, we first need to kind of, let's say, take the different steps in regards to the journey from that infrastructure layer that we're currently in toward applications, and then building communities and users around these different infrastructures as well as applications. If you look at currently, the metaverse environment, there's a couple of issues that we need to address and solve before we can really get to a point where it is a fully open, where it is a fully decentralized metaverse, right? So first of all, there's still a high degree of centralization, right? That's generally something that's, while we preach decentralization, it's still omnipresent in the crypto world, right? People may think or talk otherwise, but generally if you look at the statistics, most of the chains, most of the tokens, most of any application is still in the hands of centralized players, and it's the same with the different metaverse infrastructure layers, right? So basically, there is still this high degree of centralization that we first need to address through decentralized governance models, which become part of this ecosystem, which, you know, possess assets, you know, such as, you know, let's say IP, data, and any other form of assets within this ecosystem, such as infrastructure, like lands in the metaverses, right? And here, if we really want to foster the decentralized spirit and creating equal opportunities within this space, then that's a core issue that needs to be addressed, right? The second aspect is that generally, there's still a lack of aggregation and interoperability. So right now, we have all these different metaverses launching left and right, but they're more like islands, right? At some point, I see it more as, let's say, countries, right? So to say that there's engagement between each other, there's value exchange between each other, people socialize, people travel, so to say, from one metaverse to the other. But right now, it's just islands, right, that are not connected really. So if there is at all any connection between different metaverses, then it comes from projects that, let's say, build NFTs for various metaverses, but not from the metaverses themselves, right? So that interoperability really is something that needs to be addressed for having that intuitive user experience, that we don't fall back to the same enclosed ecosystems of Web 2 again, right? As well as the aspect of aggregation, that we aggregate infrastructure as well as tools from the different metaverses, right? So we don't have to go to each metaverse individually to leverage it or to leverage the applications, but that we have the apps, the dApps, so to say, directly within one place, right? That's something that we, for instance, with MGH DAO also are addressing by building this hub, right, of the applications. Another aspect that needs to be addressed generally within the metaverse is, if someone of you has already been there, it's not really a great user experience yet, right? At least the Web3 metaverse, so to say, as well as it's not that accessible. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, the power really is to onboard the masses to the space, to really foster mainstream adoption generally for the crypto economy with the metaverse. Right now, it's only accessible to a few, right? And this, you can see it if you look at the users' data, for instance, right? So right now, the biggest application in Decentraland is, for instance, Decentral Games, which is focusing on, let's say, gambling, like poker and so on. And they have around, let's say, 5,000 to 6,000 users a day, which maybe at first sounds like something, but if you compare it to traditional gaming or social media, then it's really nothing, right? So hence, we need more intuitive apps, dApps at the end of the day, that help users and that also foster the, let's say, onboarding process, right? So that these applications onboard users by not having to understand how do I connect my wallet to this ecosystem and everything around that, right? Or how do I engage or transfer value, but actually just how do I use it, right? That it's a seamless user experience, that these dApps become intuitive for users and really converge with that gamified experience within the metaverse. Another aspect that goes back also to the first point with the lack of, let's say, UX as well as accessibility is basically the fact that right now, right, there's still a lack of community, right? So right now, all these metaverses have launched, right? They've launched their projects, they've launched the infrastructure, the lands at the end of the day, but then there's nothing on top of these lands often, right? So people first need to build something, and then even there's a lot of metaverses where there's already a lot built, but who's actually going to use it, right? There's not enough users, so maybe you walk around for, let's say, 30 minutes and you don't see any user, right? So you need brands and communities such as DAOs to engage and enter this space, right? But for this, of course, we need, first of all, intuitive dApps in the first place, but at the same time, we need these communities to engage and actually use these ecosystems to then provide that value to the lands, right? And the last but not least, something that's to me very important is the lack of data utilization, right? Because if you really look at, let's say, the metaverse or the open metaverse and all the applications, and data is really the oil of this entire ecosystem, right? But not too many people are focusing on it, not even now, once data awareness has been, let's say, risen a bit by other players also trying to enter the metaverse, right? But in a more centralized way. Data is really something that drives this entire ecosystem because it helps you drive the respective applications. It helps you navigate better because you can take the data to analyze and provide more value to the people. Plus, you can also make data tools accessible for people to help them navigate through the space, right? And I'll get to that in a second. But generally, if we think about it, right, in the metaverse or generally Web3, data can at some point even become a form of universal basic income once we have data ownership back in our hands, so to say, right? And we generate passive income based on autonomously distributing this data to marketplaces that already monetize this data, but so far we're not benefiting from it, right? And that's something that's also possible in a much more gamified experience within the metaverse, which people do not yet focus on. So really, it's about addressing, when generally it comes to building this hub, you know, and navigating through the space, it's converging different ecosystems, right? Multi-trillion-dollar industries like crypto, right, which is quite broad with the different applications like social networks, because at the end of the day, if we want users and traction, we need these social networks to be part of the ecosystem, not necessarily that we need to onboard them per se always. Of course, we need to build bridges, but it's also about building decentralized versions of these centralized social networks, so to say, within the metaverse, right? But at the same time, bridging the users from them toward the metaverse is a key pillar if you really want adoption. And at the same time, it converges with that gaming environment. And as I said in the beginning, we are currently at the layer 1, so to say, of the metaverse. So it's all about investing and building, right? So not so much about the using part yet. From the investing and building part, it's all about, you know, providing seamless investment experiences, as well as, on the other hand, you know, fostering the agnostic building, because when we go back to what I said in the beginning, that different metaverses will address different target groups, hence it's also, of course, important for brands entering the space to build agnostically across various metaverses at the same time, right? Because then within Decentraland, you address different target groups than it's, for instance, in the sandbox, right? So you always have different users that you can funnel also toward your brand, to your company, right? The next layer that will come is really, you know, developing and aggregating applications on top of this infrastructure, right? So this is something that will then allow that entry point for users, which is right now only the infrastructure, so not so much for users per se yet. But once we have applications to drive users toward this ecosystem, and that also help them, again, navigate through it, right? That's when we actually then have these communities that are established around the different metaverses and around the different applications, right? So it's kind of this layered approach that we like to use in crypto in general, right? So the layer 1, the infrastructure, which is where we are today, and then the next step is the layer 2, so to say, the applications, as well as the layer 3, which are the communities. And then we really have the users, right? Because you have the infrastructure built, people have established themselves, brands have established themselves, and now the communities can build and thrive within this ecosystem. So at the end of the day, you know, this then, so to say, turns into the home base for users, right? Where any user, so to say, has their home base in a sense, right? From where you can then engage within the different applications, within the different infrastructure layers. You can navigate through the space, and it's kind of that convergence of the infrastructure on the one hand, as well as the intuitive application on the other. That's kind of the long-term vision, right, of what we are building also with MGH DAO. Although, of course, in the short to medium term, we want to address the current needs, and if you go back quickly, right, the current needs are investing and building. And from the investment side, we've developed, for instance, an algorithm for fair pricing valuations of metaverse NFTs, primarily lands. And from the building part, we develop agnostically across different metaverses. Now I'll go into these two sections a bit more. From the building part, you know, we agnostically develop across metaverses from the infrastructure side, right? So we, on the one hand, acquire assets in the metaverse that onboard the community and that we allow decentralized ownership thereof, right, through that DAO model. And on the other hand, through our development team, we are able to develop agnostically across various metaverses, right? For brands, for corporations entering the space. But not only this, but on top of this, we also develop tools, right, that make it much more intuitive for developers at the end of the day, for builders, right, that are currently building across the various metaverses. Because let's take, for instance, Sandbox, right? Sandbox has a very good game maker that makes it very intuitive for users to build here. But at the same time, for instance, if we go to Decentraland, then they have a builder and editor, but it's very inefficient. So for instance, we've developed an application that makes it much more efficient. It's like an SDK that connects to the builder of Decentraland and kind of uses templates and bypasses all the inefficiencies that are omnipresent there. And we are currently scaling this with Decentraland. So this is like one of these applications that, you know, first of all, push the building, and then in the next step also adopt or approach, you know, different users, because once everyone is able to build across the metaverses, right, which is currently not the case, people will then feel kind of that sense of, okay, I built something here, so I feel personally connected, right? So people will engage much more frequently within this ecosystem. So it's kind of that convergence of having, on the one hand, the assets, the infrastructure, and on the other hand, the building part, right, where you can connect this into one holistic ecosystem. But when it comes to investment part, before I dive into this, I would like to quickly touch on the relevance of data generally within the open metaverse, which I've already done a bit, right? But since it's quite important to me, I want to just quickly dive into this again so people understand it, right, a bit more. So first of all, data, of course, within this ecosystem can be seen as an asset class, right? I mean, generally, data is already an asset, but it's not yet a tangible asset class, right? So with tokenized data, by users, which is owned by DAOs, by corporations, we have this more tangible asset class that then in turn can also be integrated into DeFi, right? For instance, tokenized data as collateral into a DeFi protocol, which, for instance, the guys from DataX are already building on top of the Ocean protocol infrastructure, data tools that help users navigate through the space, as well as I would like to highlight generally the way or the importance of democratizing data within the space, right? Which then in turn, again, happens once we make data more tangible through tokenization, right? And again, apart from this, something that's also quite relevant while we engage within this Web3-based metaverse is the anonymity, right, that we have while engaging through applying the blockchain technology, as well as stuff like zero-knowledge proof, right, that allows us to verify data, but at the same time not share it, right? So that's kind of a key pillar that allows us to utilize data in different arrays within the metaverse. And the way that we approach it basically is we have this metaverse algorithm engine, right, for fair pricing valuations of NFTs, for scoping undervalued assets on the secondary market, and we have 2 layers of applications, right? From the B2B side, it's interesting for asset managers that can leverage this, for instance, trading with NFTs, for portfolio audits, for finding the best deals, right? For DeFi protocols, because right now, if you want to integrate an NFT into a DeFi protocol, this process is by far not standardized, right? It's a very manual process, as well as inaccurate process, because maybe it's based on the floor price, which is not accurate, right? So with this valuation algorithm, it allows DeFi protocols to have a much more standardized and frictionless process in regards to integrating these NFTs, as well as NFT marketplaces, which like to provide price transparency to their users, right? And from the B2C side, it's more about a search engine, right, that allows users to search and scope the best deals on the secondary market and the fair prices, for instance, like a booking.com, so to say, for metaverse assets. And that's something that we're building. There's different application layers here, right, in regards to leveraging the algorithm, right? If you go back here, that's the, so to say, use cases, and here it's kind of the technicalities behind it. So to say, it's on the one hand, you can leverage a chaining node. For on-chain data provision, you can obtain the raw data sets on the Ocean protocol marketplace. You can have API connections, right, to directly consume the data, so to say, into your respective ecosystem. We're building widgets for marketplaces like the Sandbox, right, where you have this widget integrated into a marketplace for people to leverage, as well as iframes, right? And since the time is getting a bit short, I'll skip a bit the part as to how the algorithm works, but if you're interested, you can definitely reach out to us. But in a nutshell, the algorithm takes different data from Etherscan, NFT marketplaces, from CoinGecko and other hubs, so to say, of data within the crypto space, as well as neighboring weight metrics. So for instance, for the lands, right? So based on the neighborhoods that the land is in, as well as the price history. And then we are constantly training neural networks, right, to allow the fair pricing. And the next step then really in the evolution is to also leverage data based on users, how much value is exchanged, how many users are engaging on top of the land to have even more accurate data, because it's not so much per se only about the neighborhoods that the lands are in, for instance, but also about other ecosystems. And generally, just for some feasibility, the way that it looks, for instance, for your portfolio, you can see here, right? But I'll skip this as I see the time is getting a bit short, right? You can see, for instance, undervalued land. You have the fair price here. You can check this also out on our website, metagamehub.io/valuation, right? Where you have the different lands. You can find, is the land overvalued? Is it undervalued, right? And you can find the fair price, right? And then we can conduct individual integrations of this tool into other ecosystems. And at the end of the day, the way that we provide then the value back to the users is by having defined a revenue portal where, based on the revenue that is generated from the subscription-based models to our evaluation tools, from integrations that we conduct with the algorithm, as well as from metaverse development, that basically, if we want to have this decentralized community that we help navigate through the space with, right, we have to also provide financial incentives and ownership to them. And the way that we do is by having this DAO revenue portal, where there's revenue coming in from these different application layers, and then the revenue is dynamically, based on an algorithm, distributed on the one hand back to the treasury as a DAO, right, to sustain the operations and expand, as well as to conduct autonomous buyback and burn on the secondary market, right, to have that buying pressure based on the utilization and the yeah, the success also of the tools that we provide, as well as then in turn subsequently deflationary metrics in place, right? Which is really something that is still often missing, where you have that direct connection of, let's say, a token and the respective utility and utilization within the ecosystem in general. We generally already have quite a diversified team, right, and invite everyone to join us basically on this journey, right, as we are quite diversified across the globe, working with a lot of big players. And if you're up for fostering decentralization and transparency within the crypto world, then yeah, join us, and thank you so much.